Okay, this is lecture 3B for History 111. I'm going to talk now about Indian civilization. One of the earliest Indian civilizations was Harappan civilization, which was set in modern day Pakistan, basically. It's probable that this area saw agriculture arrive from Mesopotamia about 7000 BCE. And certainly agricultural spread throughout the region between 7000 and 2500 BCE. Now, agriculture grew up along two rivers, the Indus River, which is obviously still there, and the Gaigar-Hakra River, which is a tiny sort of stream today, but satellite imagery shows it was probably a much larger river at this time period that we're talking about now. The Harappan civilization was actually unknown. Had been forgotten until the 1920s when a number of ancient cities were discovered, including Harappa, which is where the civilization gets its name. And since then, there's been a lot of research and archaeological digging on Harappan civilization. But it's really just in the beginnings because they have to decipher the language, etc. But we do know a number of things from archaeological digs. First of all, they had a lot of cities. They had several. Originally the two main cities that were discovered are Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. More recently, on the Gaigar-Hakra River, another city was discovered, Dholavira. And these cities were all in the neighborhood of 20,000 to 50,000 people. These are huge cities by ancient standards. What's really interesting about these cities, and there were dozens and dozens of smaller cities also in this civilization along the Indus River, along the Gaigar-Hakra River. And in fact, we know this civilization spread along the coast of the Indian Ocean from the mouth of the Indus River Valley. They spread down into modern day India, maybe as far as Bombay, and over into modern day Iran. And we know this is all the same civilization, because there's all of these cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Dholavira, and all the other cities, and there are dozens and dozens of other cities, they all show signs of central planning. And what I mean by that is they all have a very similar layout. They're a grid city layout with the streets all parallel or perpendicular to each other. It's very planned and managed. In addition, all the streets have uniform widths. There's like standard widths for the streets. This is going to be a super wide street, a narrow one, etc. And the narrow ones are all the same width. The wide ones are all the same width, etc. In addition, though, the bricks are all uniform in all of these cities. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, which are hundreds of miles apart. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, they all use bricks that are made on a 4:1 ratio, which means their length is 4 times as long as their height. The width is twice as long as the height. And so all these bricks are exactly the same size. All the cities have identical bricks. The streets are all the same size. The streets are all in the same grid system. There was clearly some sort of central planning going on here, right? Which implies a centralized government. And in addition, within these cities, there's some standard features. They tended to have bathhouses. Public bathhouses, big ones. They tended to have centralized granaries, and this is really impressive, they actually had sewer systems in the houses. The houses had interior bathrooms, and the bathrooms would evacuate directly into an underground sewer system that carried waste away from the city. This is really impressive central planning, right? And we know that a number of these cities, we have evidence that the city was buried in a flood, and then they built the city again on the same spot with the same street layout, with the same house layout, etc. So there's really some serious central planning and some central government activity going on here. And it's probable that they had massive irrigation works going on here to use the Indus and the Gaigar-Hakra rivers. And because the Indus varies quite a bit, and we're assuming the Gaigar-Hakra did, over the course of a year, because it gets a lot of melt runoff from the Himalayas in the spring, and then of course it tends to sort of dry up and become less voluminous in the fall and winter. You have to manage that water, right? You want to capture the spring flooding and then use that for irrigation. that you can use over the course of the growing season, just like they did in Mesopotamia, etc. Now we also know that this Harappan civilization engaged in extensive trade. Down on the Indian Ocean, some of the cities on the Indian Ocean had massive docks, right? Which implies lots of ships or even really big ships. And at one of the places, we actually we found a cache of seals, and not the animal, the actual stamps that you would put on things to show where they were going or coming from. And there were seals for like 700 different cities, right? So they were trading a lot with a lot of different. They were probably trading with Mesopotamia. They were probably trading with other parts of India. So this was a really advanced and developed civilization. Now again, we haven't yet deciphered the language fully, so we can't really say exactly more than that about, say, social classes or things like that. But the assumption is that it was fairly similar to Mesopotamian society or Egyptian society in having the fairly big class distinctions, because that centralized a government. You probably had a priestly class, and you probably had government officials who had a certain amount of wealth, so there's probably a lot of class stratification. But this civilization declined, right? We know that the civilization began to decline about 2000 BCE, and because we can see when cities were abandoned, and it basically declined dramatically, and by 1500 the civilization had essentially collapsed, and the cities had shrunk to nothing. Many of the cities had been abandoned. We also know, though, and this is interesting, that the Geiger-Hacker River dried up, right? We actually have documents, which I'll talk about in a later lecture, from the Vedic religion, which mention that the Geiger-Hacker River had already dried up. Actually, it mentions the Sarasvati River as having disappeared, and a lot of people think the Geiger-Hacker might be the Sarasvati, but that's still debated. But we know that the Geiger-Hacker River dried up, and that the documents at the time mention that it's drying up. Okay. So this is Harappan civilization. It's one of the earliest civilizations. It's one of the most complex and centralized and planned and really technologically innovative, with that sewer system and those grid planning for streets, etc. And so this is yet another civilization built along a riverbank with big cities, using irrigation, complex government, etc. So that is Harappan civilization.